everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this week's lecture from the History Teacher podcast. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Great Depression. We're going to look at the U.S. economy and how it was flawed. We're also going to go into a little bit of detail about the stock market crash. We're going to take a look at daily life and the global depression. And finally, we're going to talk about how the world responded to the crisis. So as you're listening to this first part, so we talk about the U.S. economy, think about what major weaknesses had appeared in the American economy by 1929. 1929 because in the late 20s, the world economy was like a delicately balanced house of cards. The key card that held up the rest was the American economic prosperity. If the United States economy weakened, then the whole world's economic system might collapse. And in 1929 it did. So let's take a look at the U.S. economy and how it was flawed. Despite prosperity, three weaknesses in the U.S. economy caused serious problems. These were uneven distribution of wealth, overproduction by business and agriculture, and lessening demand for consumer goods. By 1929, American factories were turning out nearly half of the world's industrial goods. The rising productivity led to enormous profits. However, this new wealth was not evenly distributed. The richest 5% of the population received 33% of all personal income in 1929. Yet 60% of all American families earned less than $2,000 a year. Thus, most families were too poor to buy the goods being produced. Unable to sell all their goods, store owners eventually cut back on their orders from factories. Factories, in return, reduced production and laid off workers. A downward economic spiral began. As more workers lost their jobs, families bought even fewer goods. In turn, factories made further cuts in production and laid off more workers. During the 1920s, overproduction affected American farmers as well. Scientific farming methods and new farming machinery had dramatically increased crop yields. American farmers were producing more food. Meanwhile, they faced new competition from farmers in Australia, Latin America, and Europe. As a result, a worldwide surplus of agricultural products drove prices down and profits up. Unable to sell their crops at a profit, many farmers could not pay off the bank loans that kept them in business. Their unpaid debts weakened banks and forced some to close. The danger signs of overproduction by factories and farms should have warned people against gambling in the stock market, yet no one heeded the warning. So what was this stock market crash? So I'm going to take a moment to explain stocks in the market. Stocks are shares of ownership in a company. Businesses get money to operate by selling shares of stock to investors or buyers. Companies pay interest on the invested money in the form of dividends to shareholders. Dividends rise or fall depending on the company's profits. Investors do not buy stock directly from the company. Stockbrokers transact in the business of buying and selling. Investors hope to make more money on stocks than if they put their money elsewhere, such as in a savings account with a fixed rate of interest. However, if the stock price goes down, investors lose money, and when they sell their stock at a low price than when they bought it. Speculators are investors who are not interested in long-term success. They want to make money quickly and hope for sudden increases in the value of stock. They try to buy stock at a lower cost and sell when the price rises. buy low, sell high. That's the slogan. So the stock market crashes in 1929. Wall Street in New York City was the financial capital of the world. Banks and investment companies lined its sidewalks. At Wall Street's New York Stock Exchange, optimism about the U.S. booming economy showed in soaring prices for stocks. To get in on the boom, many middle class, middle income people began buying stocks on margin. This meant that they paid a small percentage of a stock's price as a down payment and borrowed the rest from a stockbroker. The system worked well as long as stock prices were rising. However, if they fell, investors had no money to pay off the loan. And that's what happened in September 1929. Some investors began to feel that stock prices were unnaturally high. They started selling their stocks, believing that rates would soon go down. By Thursday, October 24th, the gradual lowering of stock prices had become an all-out slide downward. A panic resulted. Everyone wanted to sell stocks, and no one wanted to buy. Prices sank quickly. A wild shouting of 1,000 brokers and their assistants at the stock exchange became what one observer called a weird roar. Prices were plunged to a new low on Tuesday, October 29th. A record 16 million stocks were sold, and then the market collapsed. In the stock market collapse, billions of dollars in paper wealth simply vanished. People could not pay the money they owed on margin purchases. Stocks they had bought at high prices were now worthless. Within months of the crash, unemployment rates began to rise as industrial production prices and wages declined. A long business slump of depression followed. This set off what is known as the Great Depression, as it came to be called, touched every corner of American economy. By 1932, factory production had been cut in half. Thousands of businesses failed. Banks closed. Around 9 million people lost the money in their savings accounts when banks had no money to pay them. Many farmers lost their lands, and when they could not make mortgage payments by 1933, 1/4 of all American workers had no jobs. So what was life like during the Depression? During the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, millions of people worldwide lost their jobs or their farms. They faced a future without hope. At the first, unemployment had to depend on the charity of others to survive. Workers waited in line for free bread. Many jobless and their families begged for food, clothing, shelter. Some lost their homes and had to live in shanties or shacks. Others turned to thievery, abandoned their families. Local governments and charities opened up soup kitchens to provide free food. There were long lines of applicants for what work was available, and these jobs usually paid low wages. Conditions improved when national governments established programs for relief. However, recovery came slowly, and the Depression ended only when nations began gearing up for war. So what we're going to listen to now is an audio recording. It's one of the best known American songs of the Great Depression. It's called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? It was written by lyricist Yip Yarberg and composer Jay Gorney. It was part of the 1932 musical revue Americana. The song tells a story of the universal everyman whose honest work towards achieving the American dream has been foiled by the economic collapse. Let's take a listen.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed them on. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember? They called me Al. It was Al all the time. Why don't you remember? I'm your pal. Say, buddy, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, ah, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with a drum. Oh, say, don't you remember? They called me Al. It was Al all the time. Hey, don't you remember? I'm your pal. Buddy, can you spare a dime?
So how does the Great Depression in the United States affect other economies worldwide? The collapse of the American economy sent shockwaves around the world. Worried American bankers demanded repayment of their overseas loans. American investors withdrew their money from Europe. The American market for European goods dropped sharply as the U.S. Congress placed high tariffs. If you don't know what a tariff is, it's a tax charged by a government on imported or exported goods. So the U.S. Congress they're charging high tariffs on imported goods so that American dollars would stay in the United States and support American workers. The government was trying to force Americans to buy American goods. This policy backfired. The conditions worsened for the United States. Many countries who depended on exporting goods to the United States also suffered. Moreover, when the United States raised tariffs, it set off a chain reaction. Other nations imposed their own high tariffs. World trade dropped by 65%. This contributed further to the economic downturn. Unemployment rates soared. Because of war debts and dependence on American loans and investments, Germany, Austria were particularly hit hard. In 1931, Austria's largest bank failed. This started a financial panic in Central European countries and sent their economies plunging. In Asia, the Japanese economy also slumped. Japanese farmers suffered greatly during the Depression. In the rice-growing areas of the Northeast, crop failures in 1931 led to famine. Starving families ate tree bark and roots of wild plants to survive. City workers suffered too, as the value of exports fell by half between 1929 and 1931. As many as 3 million workers lost their jobs. forcing many to go back to their rural villages. The economic crisis fell heavily in Latin America, as well as many of its nations were tied to the global economy by trade in such cash crops as raw materials for sugar, beef, copper, tin. During the 1920s, world prices and market demand for these products were already dropping. As European and U.S. demand for Latin American products dried up in the 1930s, prices for these goods collapsed. At the same time, the cost of imported goods rose, pushed up by high tariffs. Latin American nations had borrowed heavily from other nations and could not repay their debts. The worldwide crisis spread rapidly. And if we take a bird's eye view of the unemployment rate. In 1928, the unemployment rate in Germany was at less than 10%. By 1932, the unemployment rate is 30%. And if we think back and look at what's going on in history at about this time, who's about to come into power in the 1930s in Germany? Hitler comes to power in 1933 at an all-time high where unemployment is high, people are vulnerable, and if you have a charismatic individual blaming other governments, other policies for a person's plight in life, they are more likely to listen to someone. In addition, the unemployment rate in the United States was at 25% during this time, and the unemployment rate in Great Britain was around 25% as well. It's not until 1934-35 that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is elected and begins his New Deal policies. Nothing happens quickly, and so, but it does start to get workers back to work. So how the world responded to this crisis. What problems did the collapse of the American economy cause in other countries? Let's synthesize that. Let's think about that. So the Depression confronted democracies with a serious challenge to their economic and political systems. Each country met the crisis in its own way. Britain starts to take steps to improve its economy. Because its economy depended on foreign trade, the Depression hit Britain severely. To meet the emergency, Britain volunteers elected a multi-party coalition known as the National Government. This government's policies were designed to rescue the nation from economic calamity. It passed high protective tariffs, increased taxes, and regulated the currency. It also lowered interest rates to encourage industrial growth. These measures brought about a slow but steady recovery. By 1937, unemployment had been cut in half, and production had risen above the 1929 levels. Britain avoided political extremes and preserved their democracy. Unlike Britain, France had a more self-sufficient economy. In 1930, it was still heavily agricultural and less dependent on foreign trade. Thus, France was somewhat cushioned against the Depression. Nevertheless, by 1935, 1 million French workers were unemployed. The economic crisis contributed to political instability. In 1933, 5 coalition governments formed and fell. Many political leaders were frightened by the growth of the anti-democratic forces, both in France and in other parts of Europe. So in 1936, moderates, socialists, and communists formed a coalition. The Popular Front, as it was called, passed a series of reforms to help workers. These reforms included pay increases, holidays with pay, and 40-hour work weeks. Unfortunately, prices increased quickly to offset wage gains, and unemployment remained high, yet France also preserved their democratic government. And finally, the socialist governments in the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Sweden, Norway also met the challenge of economic crisis successfully. They built their recovery programs on existing tradition of cooperative community action. In Sweden, the government sponsored massive public works projects that kept people employed and producing. All the Scandinavian countries raised pensions for the elderly and increased unemployment insurance, subsidies for housing, and other welfare benefits. To pay for these benefits, the government taxed all citizens. Under this program, both private and cooperative businesses prospered and democracy remained intact. Our recovery here in the United States in 1932, the first presidential election after the Depression had begun, U.S. voters, as I mentioned before, elected Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had a confident manner and appealed to millions of Americans who felt bewildered by the Depression. On March 4th, 1933, a new president sought to restore Americans' faith in their nations. And so these governments are responding to widespread unemployment simply by creating jobs, and the U.S. was no different. Roosevelt immediately begins a program to reform that he calls the New Deal. It involves large public works projects to help provide jobs for the unemployed. New government agencies gave financial help to businesses and farms. Large amounts of public money were spent on welfare and relief programs. Roosevelt and his advisors, they believed that government spending would create jobs and start recovery. Regulations were imposed to reform the stock market and the banking system. Despite all of these efforts, recovery was still slow. But the New Deal did eventually reform the American economic system, and Roosevelt's leadership preserved the country's faith in its democratic political system. So that is a quick overview and lecture. If you have any questions about the Great Depression and how it affected other countries in the world, what economic conditions were set right for the Great Depression, and how the interdependence of the economies of the world were affected by this. We can talk more about that. But as I said before, during this same time, there are some political crises that are going to start to erupt in Italy and Germany. So next week, we will talk about fascism as it rises in Europe, and I hope you are around to join me. Thank you for listening.